In today's lecture, we're going to look at the results section of research articles in general. And one of the first things is to remember that the results section is located normally between the methods and the discussion and conclusion sections. Although sometimes it can appear in other places. If a methods section is at the very end of the paper, we'll find the results section between the introduction and discussion and conclusion. Another option is that the results section can also be included with the discussion section. So you'd have one section that's results and discussion together, especially when a conclusion section follows on its own. And so you'll find different orders and different structures depending on your field and the particular journals that you're writing for. This section that we're going to call results here has different names. The most common names that we see are results, findings, or results and discussion, if it's combined with the discussion, obviously. It can also have more than one section in it, and those subsections often occur when a study has more than one experiment or observation, has more than one objective, when there are multiple research questions that you're trying to answer, or if the findings of your study are cumulative. You find out one piece and then that builds to the next piece and builds to the next piece, for example. These subsections generally have headings, the subheadings, that somehow reflect the content of that section. And you'll see different types of very specific headings depending on the sorts of divisions that make sense in any particular study. So the results section is one of the easier pieces to characterize in terms of what it's functioning as. It's certainly easier than the methods section in many cases, but it may be a bit of a challenge to compose this section and to really see all the different pieces that can work together here. The main function of the results section is to present the findings of your study, and that's why it's called the results or the findings of the particular study. But the content will depend in a large part on the content in the subsequent sections, the discussion and or conclusion sections. So exactly what gets included in your results section is going to depend on how the rest of your paper is structured. Let me give you an example so you can see how this works together. If you've got, if you're going to present the interpretation of your results in the results section, then you are not going to include that same information in the discussion section later on. In fact, you may not have a discussion section. Or that discussion section would expand those results in more detail. If you've combined the results and discussion section together, some functions in the results section may be very similar to things that would generally be included in the discussion conclusion section, and we'll talk about that later. So you can see how there's going to be this overlap of information in these next categories, and you'll have to decide where to put which information. Okay, so what are you going to include, and what do you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about the results section? As I've said, there's many different types of things that you might include, but some information seems to be mandatory. So you may choose whether or not to include some background orienting information. And I've said here general information for orienting the reader to the presentation of results. Maybe there's something that we need to be reminded of to be able to really understand your study. Or maybe you aren't going to include this information. It seems to be optional. But you do need to include specific results of your study with supporting evidence. That's the whole purpose of the results section. You must have this information. And often this is included both in text, in written words, and with some sort of graphical form. A table, a chart, a drawing, images of some kind. And it's really important to be giving meaning to this material through interpretation and explanation. You don't just present your results, you also explain what they mean. But this information could be either in the results section or perhaps in your discussion section. So although I've listed here the interpretation of the results in relation to existing knowledge in the field, and that is mandatory, it may not be in the results section. You just have to include this in your paper somewhere. Finally, there's generally a discussion of the significance of your results. What does this mean? What are the implications, and what are some conclusions that can be drawn from your results, as well as what are some of your limitations? But again, this information can either occur in the results section or in the discussion section if that follows separately. Another thing to be keeping in mind is that the decision about how to structure this part of your paper is not only left up to you, but there are also norms depending on your particular discipline and indeed the particular type of study you're doing within a discipline. So you may find that there are certain mandatory choices for everyone who writes in your field, or you may find that it depends on the type of study that you're doing in your field, and that there may be a couple different structures, but that it really does depend on the types of questions you're asking or the particular study conditions that you're using in your experiment. So there's kind of a lot of options here that you'll need to be looking at and investigating. Okay, so let's look at the moves within this section. And there are 4 moves that you'll need to pay attention to. And we'll discuss the particular steps in the structure of these moves in subsequent lectures. But within the results section, the first move we're going to talk about, and often the first move, but as we've discussed, these moves can occur in different orders, is called approaching the niche. And this is really the part of the paper where you're preparing the reader for the results. So you might be reiterating relevant information, going back to perhaps your introduction or to the method section and pulling information from there. That's really important for the reader. That information that motivated your study or information about specific choices you made in your study that somehow helps the reader remember what your narrowed piece is. Move 2 is called occupying the niche, and this is the place where you communicate your results. This is that explicit presentation of what you did in your study. And this is the piece I said before is completely mandatory. Move 3 is called construing the niche. And this is the place where you comment on the results and interpret them in the context of the study, as well as in relation to existing knowledge in the field and with relation to other studies. As we discussed, this information can be included in results, or sometimes it can be included in other places. And then finally, move 4 is called expanding the niche. And it's used to expand beyond the findings and to interpret them in this broader context of your discipline by discussing what the significance of your results is, talking about the potential implications. You know, if this is true, then other things may be also true. Outlining the limitations of your study, and these exist for all studies everywhere, and drawing general conclusions. You know, so what does this mean now that you have found X, Y, or Z? As I said before, remember that these moves and the steps within them occur in different orders depending on your field and your particular study. So as we move forward from this lecture, you'll need to review the reading about the results overview and go and look at your corpus. How is your results section structured when you look across the different papers in your field? What's the name? How long is it? Is it long? Is it short? Is it very detailed or more general? Is the information we've discussed here entirely included in the results section, or some of it included in later parts of the paper? All of this is going to help prepare you for the next lectures we're going to talk about, where we're going to discuss each move and the functions of that move one by one. And then you'll be prepared to go forth and write your own results section. The other 2 pieces here, you'll have to complete your exploration task, and then there's a short quiz based on the information from this lecture and also from your reading.